documents. There's a really good World Bank report that's just come out a few weeks ago. It's called Services Unbound, and it looks at digital services and digital technologies from the World Bank. It's focused on our region of East Asia and the Pacific, and it talks about how that economics is working to create this positive connection between digitalization and productivity. So again, this is where you, if you're in the regulator or you're in the comms ministry, you need to be taking these documents and packaging them for the Commerce Ministry, for Treasury, for the Industry Minister as part of this process, in winning some of these arguments for lower spectrum prices, for example, to make changes that are going to help you work the telecommunications sector for the benefit of the economy. I'm also pleased to say, and again, it hasn't been published, but it will be by ASEAN. My firm has done a study on looking at FDI, foreign direct investment. It's called Understanding the Digital Drivers of Inbound Investment in ASEAN's Manufacturing and Service Industries. It was approved by the ASEAN Digital Ministers in January. It'll soon be published by the ASEAN Secretariat. And it looks at the impact on ASEAN manufacturing and service industries and how digital they're becoming. And this is really important because very complex supply chains require sophisticated digital resources for communication and coordination. And that particular, so higher levels of digital maturity combined with increased FDI in manufacturing and services enhance productivity and competitiveness. Again, that's an ASEAN study, but it'll be published probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks. I wanted just to do two slides looking at spectrum price because I think this is important, and you heard my comments on the floor earlier today. So what we've seen in many emerging countries is we've seen the telecommunications sector as a valuable and very easy to tax source of government revenues. We've seen it as a proxy for the economy. So instead of reforming tax regimes, it's easy to go to the mobile phone company who is seen as a proxy for the whole economy. But the key thing is that what we need for 5G and what we'll certainly need for 6G is larger contiguous blocks of spectrum, right? And what that means is we need the per megahertz price per pop to fall. And we need it to fall on average so that we can get the larger size blocks to get the speeds and the connectivity that's required by these new technologies. And that's really important. And so when we think about some of the economics, we do see it's so important to, well, I went too far. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so what we do see is this, it's really important, and I don't want to put my Thai friends on the spot, but it's a classic example. Thailand is a classic example where you've had so higher taxes or higher spectrum prices, you've then gone down to a duopoly. So you really can't have a proper auction anymore because supply exceeds demand. So any prices that go forward are a little bit artificial as part of that process. So what am I saying is that when you work through the spectrum price, if you're going to set reserves, and I'm sure there'll be more discussion tomorrow, is preserve the ability of the weakest operator to secure enough spectrum to be competitive. And that still means they need a larger contiguous block of spectrum as part of that. And that competition in the market is really, really key because, as we've just been saying, telecommunications is important for the economy. And telecommunications services that are priced efficiently and fairly is achieved in a competitive market. And that's really important as part of the process. So My last slide. So some conclusions. Telecommunications contributes to GDP growth by improving productivity, supporting urban development, while digitalisation drives broader economic transformation. High spectrum prices create challenges to network coverage, improve quality of service and affordability. So there needs to be this balanced approach between telecommunications, which is essential, and so we need to get that right. And we need to make sure that the political process understands this important and how important telecommunications is for sustainable digital and economic growth. So some initial thoughts about improving digital infrastructure and improving or formulating better spectrum plans. Particularly in the short term, I would highlight the lack of IMT spectrum, particularly in countries like my good friends in Pakistan. They at least realise the problem. Solving it is up to them in the coming months. In Nepal, I made some comments, more to come, I think, on that space. In ASEAN, we need some more spectrum, particularly in relation to Indonesia and Cambodia. And then we've got a problem because of the use of the C-band in our region. Indonesia, Thailand, Cambodia, Myanmar have only either not assigned 3.5 gigahertz band spectrum, or they've only assigned 100 or 200 megahertz. That's just not enough. So you have to clear spectrum to make, this is important for the economy to make that work. And then lastly, there's also a real case for assigning more low band 700 megahertz spectrum. There's a whole host of countries who I won't name and shame, as the expression goes, but name and encourage, from my perspective, to make some progress on making the 700 available. And in other countries like the Philippines and Malaysia, you should do more with what you have. And if you can do that, you get better in building coverage, you get better nationwide coverage. And the release of this band is so critical for facilitating voice over LTE, voice over NR, because it becomes the link layer for 5G going forward. And it also then facilitates the switch off of legacy 2G and 3G services. With that, thank you very much. I hope that that's been helpful to you. And what I would say is my contact details are on this. If you're looking for better arguments or more detailed arguments to run to governments, email me. I have good cases, good examples, and are very, very pleased to help that in your particular situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Scott, for your comprehensive presentation from the economic point of view. He explained the relationship between the telecommunications, digitalization, and economic growth in the Asia-Pacific region. And he concluded the importance of the strategic spectrum management and the digital infrastructure to support sustainable economic and social development in the region. That is his the presentation is here. So, any question or comment to his presentation? No, no floor. I have one question to you. You consider the impact on the urban development in your presentation, but I have some interest in impact on the rural development. So do you have any observation or opinion?
Let's use an analog way and just pass it to me. Look, I think rural development is really, really key. You know, what I would say about that is that what we've seen in the pandemic in places like Australia is we've actually seen a move out from urban areas. So if you have good communications, you can live in a rural area, right? You can run your businesses online. You can come in 2 or 3 days a week to the office. So that allows a certain type of person, but it also allows what we've seen in many, many countries is a hollowing out of rural populations and workforces. So what you have do is you've got this ability to automate those services in rural and regional parts of certainly of Australia or many other countries. But part of that is having the connectivity. So number one, it's about having good broadband in those rural areas, and that could be a function of both wireless services, but also satellite services. It also means an encouragement of having IoT. So I really like NB-IoT. I often see presentations, and I'm thinking of places like the Philippines and a couple of other places where they say, the government says, oh, we want Internet of Things. And I say, no operator is invested in NB-IoT. You do not have the ability to do a good IoT offering, right? You need always to have the infrastructure. So that's really important. So I think that would be what I would say. What I would say too is there's some really good applications now coming to use the networks in rural parts of many, many countries. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your the intervention and the explanation or clarification to my question. I fully understood your point. Any further question or comment to his presentation? If not, I would like to move to the next speaker. So next speaker is Mr. Yeshen Chan, Director Spectrum, the GSMA. Mr. Chan is the Director of Spectrum Policy and Regulatory Affairs at GSMA, with the expertise in policy, regulation, and technology in the MTC sector. He previously worked at Brown Consulting, advising governments, regulators, and industry players globally. He also held roles in regulatory authorities in Singapore and UK. So today's his presentation title is Spectrum Towards 2030, IoT Trends and Addressing the Capacity Needs for Future Networks. So I'd like to ask Mr. Chan to your presentation. Mr. Chan, please.
Thank you, Dr. Soto. And good afternoon, everyone. First of all, well, it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here in Dhaka. It's the first time for me. Unlike Scott, who's been numerous occasions, but haven't had the chance to see much of the city. I just came in last night, but I think thank you very much, first of all, for the APT and the BTRC for the sort of excellent organization and hospitality. So in the next few slides, I think Scott has done a very good introduction in terms of the digital economy and the importance of spectrum towards addressing that. So I will present and talk a little bit more about, from the perspective of the mobile industry, the GSMA represents the interests of mobile operators globally. And I would like to address, in terms of what are some of the trends that we are seeing, particularly over the next 5-6 years, and how do we work towards, addressing some of the capacity needs for future networks. So where are we today? And in terms of, where do we see ourselves going towards the end of this decade? Spectrum planning is obviously a continuous and long-term process. And where we are today, we see the majority of markets, a number of markets around the world having launched 5G services, but actually the pace of which, and the status of which, 5G rollout differs very greatly across different regions, across different markets. Some markets have moved quite fast. 5G has been with them for, half a decade already, in some of the more advanced markets in Asia Pacific, such as, Japan, Korea, China, etc. Whilst many parts of the sort of rest of Asia Pacific, as well as, many parts of the developing world, 5G is only really at the very beginning. We're only at the very beginning of the sort of a long journey. But what we see coming across the rest of this decade towards 2030, that's where the majority of growth is coming from. There will continue to be growth from some of the leading markets, but also particularly from the emerging markets. That's where we see, 5G rollout happening full scale, and that's where we see the growth in connectivity and connections coming. So by the end of 2030, we're seeing 5G obviously would have overtaken 4G as the sort of dominant technology in terms of compared to 4G globally. In terms of emerging markets, we are seeing sort of the rapid growth coming over the next few years. And all of this means that in terms of thinking about spectrum planning, we need to start thinking today in terms of ensuring that we have the right amount of spectrum to support the capacity that will come on board very soon. So in terms of traffic, this is what we're seeing in terms of the growth of traffic. Now, there will be different views in terms of how fast traffic is growing, but nonetheless, the key thing is mobile data traffic is continuing to grow at a very sort of rapid rate, particularly in terms of the absolute growth in terms of traffic volumes. We've seen earlier today presentations in terms of the situation in Japan compared to even in Nepal. What we've seen, and that's undisputable, that there is huge growth in traffic in terms of the mobile data consumption, and with 5G, we're starting to see fixed wireless access, FWA, coming on very rapidly on its own as a key use case, and that alone will drive a lot of the traffic growth that we see over the rest of this decade. And just to give an indication of how much growth we're seeing, comparing to what we see, year on year over the last couple of years, let's say in 2023 to 24, that increase in traffic alone exceeds what we're seeing in terms of the total volumes of traffic just 5 years ago. So mobile data traffic is continuing to grow significantly, and we will need to make sure that we have the right spectrum resource to cater to that. And why is this important? Scott has already mentioned in terms of the impact of having good digital infrastructure in the country. Obviously, we are here to grow the digital economy to make sure that we are able to progress and make the best use of connectivity to deliver good economic outcomes and social benefits for society. Spectrum is a key input in terms of the digital infrastructure of every single country. So it's very important to make sure that we have the right foundations to be able to deliver that. And how much spectrum and how much impact on GDP that spectrum has, ultimately it depends crucially on how much capacity, what's the speed of your connections. Having not enough spectrum, that means that the mobile services in the country will be more constrained. Mobile services will be less productive in terms of how much traffic you are able to support. That means services tend to be less affordable in terms of what people can get for a certain unit of money that they pay for their services. So this is an impact that we see. And in terms of estimating what 5G's impact is on GDP growth globally, we see that continuing to grow as 5G adoption take-up continues. So by the end of this decade, assuming there is sufficient spectrum to support this traffic growth, by the end of this decade, we see 5G contributing close to 1 trillion in terms of GDP addition globally in terms of across the world. That's sort of 0.7% of GDP. Now, if you don't have enough spectrum is constrained, that means you have slower services, or it costs more to deliver services because you have to build on more sites, for example. Then the amount of benefits that we see from 5G will be impacted by up to 2/3 in terms of the loss in GDP. So that's why it's very important to make sure that spectrum policy, the spectrum strategy of every single country, we get the policies correct. How much spectrum is needed? I think I'd just like to say for mid-bands, for 5G in particular, that's really at the core of mobile networks. We talk about 5G and the mid-bands a lot, but likewise, even with 4G, mid-bands is a huge contributor to what we see in terms of the capabilities of networks. So we've done a study looking at how do different frequency bands, particularly comparing low bands and mid bands, how do they impact on the quality of service that we see? So the chart on the top is really comparing, 4G indoor speeds using, low bands versus mid bands. And that's where we really see the larger bandwidths that, we're able to deliver through mid-band spectrum really delivers the higher capacity and obviously the higher throughputs. And that is consistent across a number of major cities in the world, because that's where, the most of the demand is, the capacity is heavily required, and that's where the density of people is heaviest. And that's where mid-band is most important in delivering that. And likewise, we see in terms of for 5G, lower mid bands and the 3.5 gigahertz range will make the most difference in terms of being able to deliver at least 100 megabits per second in terms of 5G connectivity speeds. So mid-band is really important. That's at the core of all mobile connectivity. And we estimate that on average 2 gigahertz of mid-band spectrum is needed per market, especially in markets where you have very dense urban environments like where we are today in Dhaka. And upper mid-bands obviously is really important with the large contiguous bandwidth of 100 megahertz and potentially more to really, boost the 5G speed both indoors and outdoors. So why is it important? 5G, we've seen 3.5, obviously, that's the key launch band for 5G. And we've seen that being launched most widely globally across, over, 100 plus markets, 200 markets. That's the 5G launch band. And that's where the ecosystem is the strongest in terms of devices. And that helps drives, economies of scale, bringing down the sort of cost of services and devices, and that helps adoption and makes the whole, affordability and the whole ecosystem viable. And that helps drives adoption in the first wave of 5G rollout. But more importantly, as we plan, for 5G expansion across the rest of this decade, more spectrum will be needed. And that's why, at the last WRC 23, there was the decision taken by a number of countries across each of the 3 global regions to identify the 6425 to 7125 gigahertz, the 6 gigahertz band for IMT use, because that helps provide the additional further expansion of capacity, whilst also making use of the existing networks that have been rolled out over the 3.5 gigahertz range. And that ultimately means that, we are able to deliver more capacity over the similar network that we have. Then that means in the benefits in terms of lower network density, lower emissions in terms of, avoiding, additional rollout of networks. So we see this as a continuous evolution of mid-band spectrum from the 3.5 towards the 6 by the end of this decade. And we've done a sort of huge study that looks at, how, we can optimally make use of the upper 6 gigahertz band to deliver that. So that's a new study that's been released by the GSMA late last year. So we already know the situation in terms of, mobile spectrum that's available, and that's really differs across, a wide range of countries. So different countries, as I said at the start, are at different stages in the progress in terms of, where they are with 5G. At one extreme, we have some of the leaders in APAC who have released over 1 gigahertz of spectrum for mobile usage in the low and mid bands. At the other end of the spectrum, there are countries who are, in the progress of planning for their 5G release plans, and a number of these includes, Bangladesh, where we are, Indonesia, Pakistan. They're all planning for spectrum awards in 2025. So it's very important that, making sure that we have the right spectrum, particularly in mid-band, to support that. And as you will see in the chart, having the upper mid-bands, that's really 3.5 and above, is really important to help us move towards the 2 gigahertz needs in the mid-bands. Okay, so how do we do that? And we do that by having a clear spectrum roadmap. We've already heard from, presentations earlier today, what different countries are doing and what they're planning. I think it's very important to make sure that, a roadmap doesn't mean that you have to, do things immediately, but a roadmap means that, you set out your plans for the specific steps in the right order to make sure that you get the right results that you want at the end of the day. It's about identifying the key bands that you need to serve the sort of needs for mobile connectivity, taking steps to make sure that, the spectrum is cleared out, the spectrum is clean, there are mitigation and coexistence measures that need to be put in place where required, and then making sure that you design the spectrum award in the right way. Spectrum prices, I think we've already heard, discussions already why it's very important, because whilst you want to make sure that the spectrum is available, you also want to make sure that the players, that the operators who are rolling out the network have the right incentives to make sure that they roll out the best network for the industry and for the people. And then finally, obviously, this makes sort of the implementation of the award very important in terms of making sure the pricing is correct, the conditions are correct, to make sure that you have the right incentives for sustainable long-term investment. And I think to get right in terms of the national spectrum policy and strategies. Reserve prices, I think we have seen that sort of, increasing in the number of recent auctions over the last number of years. So it's very important to make sure that as a policymaker, as a regulator, you make sure that reserve prices must be set conservatively below what the sort of market value of price is, because that allows the auction process to work out in terms of discovering what the right price is. We need to make sure that there are mechanisms as much as possible that allow mobile operators to, maybe exchange some of the financial burden of paying spectrum fees into actual investment commitments to roll out networks. I think that provides the right incentives for us to get the right outcomes that we like to see. Where there's spectrum that is required, make sure that the spectrum is made available as soon as it's required. This helps avoid artificial scarcity, which obviously delays the rollout of networks and also drives up prices, which leads to negative outcomes that we all want to avoid. And as much as possible, it's important to make sure that conditions that are placed on operators, either in terms of making sure that they roll out the networks or making sure that they hit certain targets in terms of quality of service, these need to make sure that in designing them, you need to take real care in making sure that they're done with the right incentives to make sure that operators do not jeopardize their plans in terms of how they develop and roll out their network plans. I think it's important to make sure that there is flexibility both in the licensing conditions to make sure that operators have the right sort of plans that they can put in place to deliver their networks. So, and last but not least, I think I've already mentioned, long-term spectrum roadmaps is really important, and really you need to prioritize public welfare benefits over short-term, government revenues, because ultimately, in delivering the right, connectivity infrastructure, that's where we ultimately get the greatest benefits in terms of GDP growth for the country and the economic development of each and every digital nation. So I think with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chan, for your presentation. The spectrum toward 2030. Any question or comment or suggestion? Yes, please.
Hello again. I'm Ahmed Miri from Islamic Republic of Iran Regulation. My question is, from the beginning, we heard a lot that the spectrum must, and we know that this huge data that are passing between the consumers has a specific on IoT. Most of the desired data are must have be from the IoT, but I didn't hear anything that we are preparing something that is specifically for the IoTs. My question is which frequency bands and how bandwidths are specified or suggested for IoTs in this growth, and what is the revenue that we are desire from the spectrum on we determine for IoT.
Okay, I can make a first step at the answering. I think the question was which bands are suitable for IoT use. Yeah. So I think in terms of obviously the technology is there to, and it's sort of technology neutral, and any frequency bands that have been allocated or assigned for IMT is capable of supporting IoT services. But if we're looking at trying to make sure we have as much wide area coverage as possible to allow the sort of I guess what we call massive IoT type services that is done in the most affordable way, then I guess low band spectrum will be adequate, will be the most appropriate spectrum to use. But also bearing in mind that the revenues that comes from some of these services will be quite different from how we think about traditional cellular mobile services. So it's important to make sure that the conditions for making use of some of the spectrum that you assign is flexible enough to allow operators to make use of low band spectrum for their public mobile networks, and also to make use of some of these spectrum to deliver wide area NB-IoT services where it's required. It's a process where it's evolving. You need to make sure that you experiment with the right use cases because it takes a while to make sure you get the right sort of business model in place for the mobile operators who are developing these use cases. So I would say go for low band spectrum if you're looking at making sure that you have wide area coverage across, particularly in rural areas. But it doesn't mean that you preclude other frequency bands that operators may have in terms of using that. So I would say service technology neutrality will be a very important step, and that's sort of a step that all regulators should implement. But it's something that operators need to make sure that they have as much flexibility as they have in making use of the sort of spectrum that they have hold of.
Yeah, can I just add there? Look, I think there are obviously some IoT applications that exist in unlicensed bands, but if I can just focus in on licensed bands, there are really two flavors, right? You've got the NB-IoT type offering, which is a very narrow band offering, which allows you to have battery type devices, or you have LTE-M. Now, both of those services are best deployed. I think those operators that have done that best have deployed them in lower sub 1 gigahertz frequencies. So 900 megahertz is possible, 850, but 700 megahertz is probably the best if you can include it in that band. So that would be my advice to you. It's a very small sliver of spectrum, and it does, as Yi-Jin has said, it does require an operator to really have a business case and work through those issues. But it's really chicken and egg. If you do not have the network, you don't have the business case and you can't sell it. And at a nationwide level, you really want those things to happen because they're really good for smart metering. They're really good for transport logistics. They're really good for working out whether there's rainfall or seismic activity or whatever it is. All of those devices and applications exist. So, so I think that's also important. Also in the new area, which we haven't spoken about much today, about public safety mobile broadband, another area where there's the increasing use of IoT. So let me finish my response there. Happy to take it offline with you, but because I think there's some very good case studies around from operators in that space. Thanks.
Thank you, Scott, for your further consideration and comment. Any further question or comment? I have just a quick question to you. In your presentation, the mobile evolution through 6 gigahertz, is that the key message from the GSMA? However, that the as you know well, that in Japan, the 6 gigahertz have already allocated to the fixed services. So I think that there are many countries such situations. So how can I do?
Yeah. Okay. No, no. I think that's quite a. There are obviously different incumbent use cases in different countries, and the extent to which they are deployed will differ by countries. I think we believe that the 6 gigahertz is really important. Obviously, there are the competing users in the band. We will probably discuss this in a bit more detail maybe tomorrow in terms of, I think it's already been mentioned by Dr. Arturus earlier today in terms of, the sort of Wi-Fi potential use. We believe that, with the whole of the 6 gigahertz band, which is obviously covers 1200 megahertz of spectrum, many countries have already, sort of taken the decision to allocate the lower sort of 500 megahertz for unlicensed use. And in terms of how much spectrum we need in the longer run, I think looking ahead over the continued growth of 5G and towards 6G networks, we believe the 6 gigahertz is very important. But the timing of which different countries will require the 6 gigahertz will differ. So in terms of with the right spectrum roadmap and long-term planning process in place, I think it's not going to happen overnight, but we need to make sure that we are able to cater for the future demand of mobile, and that's where 6 gigahertz is really important, coming into sort of supplementing the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum. So for some countries, I think it will be trickier, but I think that's something that we'll need to work with in terms of the long-term spectrum planning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chen, for your the comprehensive comment. I will discuss further with our government later. Okay, if not from a comment or question from the floor, so move to the next the speaker. So next speaker is the Miss Isabel Mauro, the Director General of the GSWO. She will join the symposium through the remote access. Is that right? She have already? Okay. So the Ms. The Isabel Mauro, to your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, excellent. So thank you, and thanks so much for the APT for this opportunity. And everybody mentioned, first time or several times in Dhaka. I myself came to Dhaka 20 years ago, as I was still working in the mobile industry at that time, and that's what kept me in the technology, industry. There was a fantastic project at the time of the ladies' phone villages, which was very inspiring, and it is really what has brought me forward in my career to look at, how technology can close the digital divide. So very happy to be here with you today. GSOA represents, on the next slide, 70 members from the satellite ecosystem. Could we have the next slide, please? And we not only represent operators, but also operators in all orbits, whether they are LEO, GEOs, or multi-orbit operators, Earth observation, but also vendors, launchers, and manufacturers. And we are, of course, operating at a global level, but with a very focused regional aspect as well, tailoring to the efforts, that we need for all of our members in the different communities everywhere. Next slide. In terms of, digital technologies, of course, we're dramatically changing the world, whether it's through mobile, satellite, or many other of the, available, if you want, applications or technologies. But in the digital era, I think it's fair to say, as advanced such giant steps in recent years, that really the biggest challenge that we face today is ensuring that nobody is left behind. And I think it's interesting that we take a slightly different approach in my presentation today. I don't want to talk just about spectrum and the needs that we have, as industry, but also what are we actually doing that justify that we may need, whether it's more spectrum or more agile policy frameworks. So if you go to the next slide, in this common mission that we all have of connecting everyone everywhere and improving everyone's life, non-terrestrial networks, particularly satellite, are playing really a transformative role in the connectivity landscape. And I think, nobody is immune to see the incredible growth that we've experienced in our industry in the last 5 years, at least, which has become really exponential. So let's consider the unique qualities of satellite technology. First of all, global coverage, whether it is on land, in the air, or at sea. So that's really ubiquitous. Second, we have a quick deployment in a cost-effective manner, allowing immediate access to high-speed capacity networks. And finally, empowering community and enabling essential services, including in areas that would not otherwise be covered by other technologies. Next slide. So indeed, the unique feature of satellite are workless if they are not coupled with services and use cases that grow economies and have a social impact. So satellite communications have long been at the forefront of global connectivity, providing essential services such as internet access, television